But take a look at Portland sometime. These are wild, these are crazy people.
There are two new developments today as we track President Trump's order to send in the National Guard to Portland.
At the core of today's hearing was a question of how much the president gets the benefit of the doubt when federalizing the National Guard under U.S. Code 12406.
This explains when the president can use the National Guard. Is that right?
I said these three things over and over and over again for months.
The president's 12406 determinations are entitled to great deference, but that deference has a limit.
This is hardly the peaceful and sedate crowd that plaintiffs tried to make it out to be. These are violent people.
You all argued that there was not a rebellion.
We used one thing, and it was the facts. This does not meet the societal definition of rebellions. When President Trump says something, right, or sometimes when he even does an executive order, we have to look at those things and then assess whether this is thunder or whether this is lightning.
Today, I'm talking to a rising star both in Oregon politics and really national politics, Attorney General Dan Rayfield. Now, Dan Rayfield won his election in 2024, so really the first year of his administration has been somewhat overshadowed by various legal battles with the Trump administration. One of those has been his legal defense, keeping the deployment of National Guard troops from coming to Portland. We're going to talk about some of the little details I think are important to understand some of the legal theories here, but also some of the bigger context to understand what was happening at the time as these things were playing out in court. So basically what I want to talk about today is the strategy and kind of a post-mortem almost at the successful defense of keeping the troops out of Portland when the Trump administration decided that they wanted to deploy troops to Portland. For people who are a little confused by the whole thing, it was really back and forth, and there was a lot of different moving pieces. Do you have an elevator pitch? Do you have a way to succinctly kind of sum up what your office's efforts were and what the outcome was?
If it was a long elevator ride, I could have an elevator pitch if you need. The truth of the matter is, we knew this was something that was going to go on, right? This is something that the president had talked about during his campaign. So a lot of research had been done prior to this moment. The other thing for folks to remember is we weren't the first state that this happened, right? This happened in California and in other states. And so we were prepared. We started getting rumblings that this would go on. And so the first thing is, how is he going to do it? Because he could have federalized the National Guard different ways, right? Was he going to use the Insurrection Act? Was he going to use the statute that he ultimately did? So we need to know those factors. So you hear rumblings that this might occur, then you wait for it to be what some lawyers will say papered, if you will, right? So say, I'm going to do this, but then how do you do it? So we learned the statute that he's using, which was the same one that had been used in California. And then our team at the Oregon Department of Justice worked on that to get a lawsuit filed as quickly as possible. That was done within 12 hours of seeing the mechanism and the formal orders. And then the drama unfolded, right? So the entire week you have lawyers and staff at the Department of Justice preparing for this hearing for a temporary restraining order. It gets granted by the judge. Right after it was granted, we then start hearing more rumblings, right? The more gossip, if you will, in this world that, hey, the California National Guard might be immobilized, or the Texas National Guard might be coming up, which for anyone else, you're thinking, the judge just told you no, right? You're not supposed to be doing that. So then we again got our staff and our lawyers who were working throughout the weekend to file a second temporary restraining order. Now, anyone who was listening got on that phone call that evening. I put it on speakerphone. My wife and I and as we were, because she was interested. We all wanted to hear, well, how is the judge going to react under those circumstances? Was this, a cute way for the government to try and get around the judge in a way that they thought was legal, or was the judge going to believe that they were really trying to manipulate the process and they were too cute under the circumstances? And for a lot of folks that heard the tone and the temperament of the judge that evening, I think drew the conclusion, and myself, I certainly drew the conclusion that she was incredibly irritated. Yeah. I think is probably a polite way to put it.
This was a phone call. It was a Sunday evening.
Yeah.
I was out. My mother-in-law was in town, and we were at a food cart pod on Mississippi, and I had to step away because suddenly I had to work because there was this I don't know, 7 or 8 p.m. conference call to decide whether or not troops were going to be coming to Portland.
Oh, it was the most bizarre thing because there are people who are not really connected into the legal world, non-lawyers, but this was incredibly important to their community, what was going on. So I would go around for the next couple of weeks and people would sit there and say, the lawyers and the staff at the Oregon Department of Justice are wonderful. I was listening to the hearing on Sunday night, right? It was so much, interest in this. And who knows, you probably experienced this, that the actual phone line that evening was not working and it ended up being delayed. I think it was about an hour.
Yeah, there were some technical difficulties.
Yeah. So who knows if that was volume or what was going on. But then the judge ruled again. Hey, doesn't matter who it is. The order is the order. You can't do this. Now, a temporary restraining order is just that. It's temporary. So we had to work to get finality in the case. That eventually culminated in a trial, right, where the whole idea is you get real facts in front of a judge who can, from a sterile perspective, look at actual real facts under oath and make a decision whether those facts gave the president the power to use the statute that federalized the National Guard. And ultimately, in this situation, the judge looked at the facts on the ground and said, no, these set of facts does not give you, Mr. President, the ability to federalize the National Guard. It just doesn't rise to that level. So
just to bring it back a little bit, this started September 27th is when Trump sent the federalization order. Pete Hegseth then issued the memorandum. You all filed suit the same day. I want to talk a little bit about the timing. The ability for you all to have a lawsuit filed in full, ready to go, the same day that Pete Hegseth issued his memorandum deploying troops to Portland. How was it that you all were able to move so quickly?
So we started hearing about this possibility before the final orders were there, right? And you have.
What do you say you're hearing about it? Where are you hearing it?
So it's just
social media, just the rumors,
right? And President Trump is not one for keeping his thoughts to himself.
Sure.
I'm sure a lot of his staff would wish he would, or they would have taken away his Twitter handle by now. But that's not a thing. So you have in this ecosystem where we are having a little bit of lead time, and there was a lot of research that had been done. Again, because you're going back to the campaign almost, a year prior that we've been looking into these things. We have, the examples of what went on in California. So we're able to start with a little bit of, if we're using a cooking analogy, we had a basic recipe and then we had to fine tune it to our unique set of circumstances here in Oregon. So we began that process and then we waited to see what those final orders were, if they were going to come. Because this is the other thing with the president. Sometimes he says things and he doesn't follow through with them. So again, you want to make sure that you're grounded. You want to make sure that there's integrity to what you file with the court, because work product matters in these cases. And that was kind of how it all came about. And then most importantly, right, it is the staff and the attorneys that effectively gave up their weekend and that time to be able to do this at a moment's notice. And that is I think, a really unique feature of public servants in this current day and age, that they're willing to sacrifice like that.
So just from kind of like a technical perspective, did you all have parts of the complaint written out? Did you have chunks kind of ready to go, or alternative, chunks of text that you had prepped before the announcement came? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. You're working on all of those different elements leading up to that, and you're gathering your facts as best you can. But again, kind of that critical final piece that you absolutely must have are the final orders saying how and when and what we're going to do, right? And so that was the buildup beforehand. And there's different strategies, right? We could have made a legal decision to wait until the National Guard troops were on the ground in Portland.
Right.
We made a very different strategic decision to move out ahead a little bit faster. And that was our goal, was to actually prevent that from happening in the first place, right? And hindsight's always 20/20, right? We could have gone down the road that we went and been unsuccessful, and maybe people would criticize us. But we felt confident in our legal strategy, and we felt that that was the best outcome, frankly, to keep tempers down. Right, we felt very confident that once the National Guard troops got there, that would only make the situation worse.
Yeah,
and so we really wanted to.
Folks.
Yeah.
I think that's something I'm actually really curious about is that timing, because very similar timing, we saw troops being deployed to Chicago, and the Illinois Attorney General took that other pathway and waited until the troops were on the ground to file a lawsuit to try to declare that deployment illegal. I'm curious, from a perspective, just from a legal theory perspective, if you know that you're going to file this lawsuit and that you're going to request a TRO, a temporary restraining order, is part of the theory and the planning around this maintaining that status quo of them not being here versus a TRO asking them to go away? Like, is it advantageous to try to factor in like what the status quo is while you're asking for a temporary restraining order?
And of course, I mean, I think what we were really focused on was outcomes, right? And then looking at what was some of the best arguments that we could make moving forward to get towards that outcome. And each state and each set of circumstances are going to be different, right? I think if you had attorneys in Illinois or in California, they're likely going to make the same decisions in those states. What was right for Oregon works for us, and it made sense given the set of circumstances that we had on the ground, right? In this case, you had a president that was making some statements, frankly, based upon footage that he saw from 2020 that had nothing to do with the present set of circumstances. And so we knew that the facts in Oregon were incredibly strong moving forward. And so again, all of these different things kind of weave into the decisions you make on when to do what you're going to do.
And I think just to kind of, for the viewer and for anybody who's watching, just to clarify that, is that right before the decision from the Trump administration, from Donald Trump to deploy troops to Portland, there had been this segment on Fox News that had aired that had kind of talked about the chaos going on in Portland. That I don't know if it at that time said that the city was on fire, but it used a bunch of footage from 2020 without making it clear that that was old footage. And so just to clarify that was some of the context around this all happening. I wanted to also hone in on what happened after that first TRO, that first temporary restraining order was granted. So the judge comes out, I think it was ruled on a Saturday. Mm-hmm. She issued the ruling saying, you can't, dear federal government, you cannot deploy Oregon National Guard to Portland until X date while we figure this case out. How soon after that did you find out that there were efforts to circumvent that temporary restraining order?
That evening. Right, you start learning about it, and again, the administration has a tough time keeping their mouth shut. But it almost feels like you're dealing with your 12 or 11-year-old kid, right? Where you're saying, hey, no, you can't, you can't do that. And it's like, well, what if I do it just a little bit different, right? And it's like, well, if I can't use the Oregon National Guard, well, maybe I can use the California Guard. Maybe I can use the Texas National Guard. Right. I mean, it was the absurdity of what was going on was just wild. It was perplexing. But again, that moment, right? It was very short-lived. We have a ruling that comes down. It was a big news story, right? Everybody was talking about it. Everybody in the state was paying attention to that occurrence, that order. And then within hours, we then have to mobilize our attorneys, staff again, to begin working to make sure that we get something filed the very next day, right? Because these things are happening very quickly.
Well, and to be clear, I don't know what time you found out, but we know that mobilization of California Guard was happening in the middle of the night, literally in the middle of the night. Did you at any point during that time have a chance to talk with Attorney General Bonta? Were you guys in contact? Because I know that this is his backyard. And I know that you two do work together on some of these things. I'm curious, what was the communication there?
Well, first and foremost, our teams are talking, as well as Attorney General Bonta and myself did speak as well. And so you have Saturday night, right? We get this positive order. It's based upon the facts that are going on. That evening, you start getting the rumblings that they're going to be cute and try and mobilize different forces. At that time, you have staff and attorneys that are working towards the next temporary restraining order. On Sunday, Attorney General Bonta and I spoke, and if I remember correctly, he was at his his mother's birthday party. And so he was, again, just like normal people going through their lives. You
Saturday
have
night.
events that are going on, right? And so, and I think it was Sunday. And so Sunday we speak, and then we ended up, filing that second temporary restraining order. And obviously California was a big partner in that second temporary restraining order because it was involving their National Guard as well.
Jumping forward a little bit, something that we found out later on once this case did go to trial was that that temporary restraining order didn't fully prevent any troops from being deployed. We found out later on during trial, the government said explicitly that a certain number of troops had been deployed to the ICE facility before the temporary restraining order was put in place. And that they completed their mission that ended, I think, 6 or 7 hours afterwards. From your memory or just thinking about that, does anything about that particular part stand out for you?
Not really. I mean, I think our goal, you kind of mentioned this a little bit earlier, was like, how do you maintain the status quo, right? And so in Oregon, the National Guard was not under the purview of the governor, right? They were able to federalize, but they prevented them from being deployed effectively, right? So maintain that status quo, and I think that was what our goal was, because that's the outcome, right? Let's not inflame any situation. Let's figure out how we're going to deal with this and ensure that we're enforcing our laws as intended. And that, I believe, the judge did a really good job of trying to strike a balance between those two things and allowing the time to unfold, to have a full hearing into what was going on, right? And so as a judge, you're balancing, right? Once I get into the trial, maybe I rule differently. Maybe I go a different direction. So I'm going to try and preserve the status quo, but also giving the flexibility that if for some reason I get into the trial and I think that the president does have authority, right? I haven't taken so many steps that it's really detrimental to any one party. And I thought she did a really wonderful job of balancing that. And I'm sure there's some people who would have preferred, hey, let's get a full sweeping win in some of these early temporary restraining orders. But again, you're really trying to be as fair and balanced in these rules as you possibly can.
Now, while this was all going on, we also got a visit from the Secretary of Homeland Security. Kristi Noem came to the ICE facility in Portland. Was that on your radar? I guess the question is does that kind of, I don't want to call it a stunt, but kind of a very public visit, does that play into what's happening in the courtroom, or is it really separate?
Right. And first and foremost, I was unaware that she was going to come, and that day, obviously I checked my missed calls, and she had not phoned me, as she usually does when she comes to Portland, which is never. But it was a very bizarre event for all of us, right? This is, frankly, what felt. And this is going to be a judgment statement, right? It felt very politicized. It did not feel that visit was intended for outcomes. When you start taking social media vloggers onto the top of federal buildings, institutions, I don't feel comfortable about that, right? That does not. That feels like propaganda rather than what I would like my federal administrators to be very focused on the job and task at hand, to then go into a diatribe eventually down the road where she is talking about, boy, they did a good job of hiding all of the problems in Portland.
I was in Portland yesterday and had the chance to visit with the governor of Oregon and also the mayor. They're in town, and they are absolutely covering up the terrorism that is hitting their streets.
It just felt silly, right? And so while those types of things are maybe not necessarily important facts in terms of did the president have authority to federalize the National Guard, I really do think it filters into the ecosystem of what we were all experiencing at that time and just the silliness of this, right? Which I think was wonderfully reflected in the way many in Portland chose to respond, which is, Mr. President, if you're going to make silly statements and do silly things and violate the law, we're going to kind of, do line dancing outside the ICE facility and kind
have
of
a naked bike ride.
Yeah, have a naked bike ride. Make a mockery of, what you're trying to do because it is that goofy, right? Let's look at what's going on here. So I do appreciate that. But it was a very bizarre moment.
I think that folds in pretty directly into kind of the core of the case itself, which is, does the president have the authority to deploy the National Guard to Portland? And I did want to, because I think this is so crucial to it. I brought 2 copies of this so we can both
You brought a
look at
binder?
it. I brought a binder.
Oh my
I spent
gosh.
too much time with lawyers like you and like everybody else.
Have you read everything in that binder?
I've read almost everything. Half of these are my notes, and then the other half is Judge Immerget's 100 and something page decision on it. So
What was your favorite part of the decision?
what was my favorite part of the decision? I think probably the references to 1800s era dictionaries to try to define the word rebellion. And that's actually exactly what we're going to talk about there. Did you have a favorite part?
Nice segue.
Yeah,
nice
thank
segue. I would just say I do enjoy a good judicial opinion that educates me.
I got it. So we'll come back to this in a second because I do want to hear your thoughts on this. I was fascinated, in her opinion, to read so much history, right? There were truly historical lessons in there like I would have gotten in high school American history, AP, probably beyond AP history. But, that's not something that I'm used to see. I've been covering federal courts and federal rulings for, 10 or so years now. Is that kind of thing, is that normal? And I guess the question is does that have to do with the current Supreme Court and kind of this new emphasis on historical analogs? And now we're seeing district judges adding that into their decisions and their opinions.
I mean, you're certainly seeing it more, right? Like in our tariffs case, right? You started looking at the opinions that were going on, and you start really seeing some historical knowledge. And I also think it's important at this point in time in our country's history. I think we should, as Americans, know this history and understand why we have the things we have. Why do we have co-equal branches of government? Why can't Congress just give all their powers to the president? And I think we forget those things. I think we've had the luxury of taking those things for granted for so long. And I think we're in a little bit of this re-education. The thing that, it drives me bonkers sometimes is I'll see every now and then some response to something that we say or do. And it is, and for their perspective, right, they have a political lens that they're seeing the world, and I think they want to find a rationale for why they believe they do, but it is historically incorrect. And those are the things that frustrate me because I think we as Americans have, for a while, right, we just haven't had to think about these things, and we do right now. So I'm kind of, in some ways, optimistic that maybe this is a part of our re-education as Americans about some of these principles in our society.
So what I just handed you is kind of the core of this case. It's U.S. Code 12406. This is the Armed Forces National Guard in Federal Service Call. I don't know if that's the official title of it, but I'm sure you're familiar with this. But this is essentially the justification. This explains when the president can use the National Guard. Is that right?
I mean, I said these 3 things over and over and over again for months, right? It says, are you being invaded? Right? Is there a rebellion, or is there a danger of a rebellion? And then the last one, which is where they really relied upon, can the President of the United States, I'm going to summarize it, right? Can they not effectuate the laws of the country? Right.
But it basically says that there's 3 circumstances where the president can call up the National Guard. And I also think it's important to step back for a second here and acknowledge that the National Guard is a pretty unique military institution where they're basically serving, they have a dual oath, right? Where they are both state National Guard and can be National Guard. Federal National Guard. And so this was a bit of an education for me when this all kind of started coming up. But this is Title 10 is the mechanism that the president can use to call up National Guard. And you have to have one of these 3 things happening. As you just said, there has to be an invasion. That one was never really on the list. That was never really proposed by the government.
Now you got to be careful. Any good lawyer could make an argument for anything.
Well, I think there were some questions around that. I think with Venezuela, there was some. We'll get into that when we talk Insurrection Act here in a few minutes. But
and we should say this is something we would want the president to have this power,
Right.
right? An invasion or the threat of an invasion.
Right.
Absolutely, you need this power.
When you read these things in a hypothetical of a real serious emergency or a threat to the nation or to the laws of the nation, like, I don't know, for me as an American, like, this is like, yeah, that makes sense. I would want there to be force brought in if like a state was seceding, something like that. That I get it. So let's talk a little bit about 2 and 3. 2 is all about rebellions, and 3 is all about unable to do your job as the federal government. The government argued both of these things. When you saw that those were the reasons, or when your team saw that these were the reasons that they were citing to bring the National Guard in, what were your initial, or how did you strategize to disprove their argument? What did you guys use as kind of the framework going into kind of making a 12406 argument, or I guess defending that argument?
We used one thing.
Yes.
And it was the facts.
That's fair. Okay.
It's evidence.
Right. Well,
right?
So let's break into that. So when they say rebellion, you all argued that there was not a rebellion. Why and how did you argue that there was not a rebellion?
Sometimes when you think about a legal case, and you can make, in lawyers, we love words, right? We love to make sentences longer than they need to be. Sure. We love to be confusing. That's our job. That's how we do things. But sometimes common sense is this prevailing thing that just sits inside of you. And anyone going around that Portland ICE facility just kind of knew in their gut, this does not meet the societal definition of rebellion, right? Now, as lawyers, we're going to get technical with all of those things and why, and that's where you get into some of those, okay, here's these, older definitions, and right, and we'll do all of that. We will do our homework. But some of the most powerful things in some of these cases when we all just know as a community, this just doesn't meet that standard. Yeah. And I think that was an unspoken powerful element to this case, that there wasn't a rebellion or a threat of a rebellion, right? All of us felt that way. Now, so when you're sitting in the federal government's shoes, you're walking in, and all lawyers sometimes will say, well, this probably isn't our best argument, right? And they know that in the back of their head, right? And I think that was kind of telegraphed as that hearing came about, right? I think the more meat of that was on kind of that third component.
Now, I think it's interesting to back up and again look historically. This is also a law that has not been widely litigated. There's not exactly, law is in a sense a case study in history because law builds on itself. It builds on precedent. There's not a lot of precedent here. There's not a lot of previous court cases to respond to. How does that make it more challenging for you all in terms of the work that you're doing? Do you have to do more research? Do you have to define more difficult things? I don't know. How hard is it to do something with a law that hasn't been really covered that much?
Of course, there can be good and bad with that, right, on both sides. So it depends. Half empty, half full glass, that type of mindset. It didn't really, under these circumstances, I don't think we were terribly bothered by that. Okay. Just because, again, getting back to some of the plain meaning of these terms, there's typical statutory construction that people will go through. And so as we looked at this, when it comes to a rebellion or the danger of a rebellion, that's very different. Now here's where if you wanted to be in the federal government's shoes, right, I think they have a compelling argument. And I actually agree with them in some respects. The president should be given deference to what is a rebellion or what is not a rebellion. There should be deference given to the president on whether there's an invasion or a threat of invasion. The last thing that you would want to have happen, right, there's an invasion going on, right, and someone comes in and says, no, Mr. President, there isn't an invasion. Right. And we're litigating that while the president can't act under a certain set of circumstances. So I do think societally it is important to give deference to the president. That does exist in case laws. When you read the government's briefs, they rely very heavily on giving the president that deference. The difference here was it was so black and white, right? Yeah. All of us knew that these standards just weren't met, right? And that's kind of the little bit of clarifying factor there.
Now, that deference standard, that is very recent. I mean, that is, well, the current understanding and definition of it just came from California earlier in the year from the Newsom case, well,
the deference stuff is even way beyond that, right?
In terms of deference.
Yeah, courts giving the president a ton of deference. So there's a ton of history there. And again, right, I would submit that you kind of want that. Now, hopefully we've elected a president that has restraint and is following these statutes and following their oath and doing the best they can under the circumstances, right? We believe that obviously that wasn't the case right now, and that these were just patently hadn't met some of those things.
So I think that's important to understand with this case is that you did go into this case with specific judicial instructions to a judge saying you have to give deference to the government's case, to the president. But I think it's important to understand that deference doesn't mean turn a blind eye. It doesn't mean just take him at his word, regardless of the facts.
Because I also think we do have a responsibility to some degree in how case law gets developed.
Yeah.
And this is the thing that I think right now, I think some of the Republicans, as they're doing some of these things and they're pushing for this expansive executive power, the thing that they're not asking themselves is what happens when we have a transition to a Democratic president.
Right.
I would argue it's equally bad for a Republican to expand their executive authority in a way that is not lawful in the same way that a Democratic president doing that. And so we would argue, for instance, in the tariffs case, and you even heard Justice Gorsuch talk about this, using in the tariffs case these emergency powers where you can declare an emergency for anything and put a tariff for limited amounts for any reason across any product for any amount of time, right? Now a Democratic president gets in. There's a climate emergency, right? Same thing applies. Right. And you can imagine, for folks that don't believe climate change is real, the consternation and frustration and that would occur there. And so, again, we have to view these things in what's good for society, not necessarily one president or another president. It's very important in how we're analyzing these things.
Yeah. Want to circle back to some of the temporary restraining order stuff. I'm curious your thoughts. After the temporary restraining order 1 and 2 were both filed, the government appealed to the Ninth Circuit asking for those temporary restraining orders to be stayed, to be paused. Mm-hmm. They only appealed one of the 2 temporary restraining orders. And that was questioned both in the courtroom by political pundits, by legal pundits, of why they had done that. I'm curious if you have any perspective or any thoughts on why the government only challenged one instead of both of those TROs.
Ultimately, I don't know. There could have been a lot of different reasons why that could have occurred. I mean, we could speculate, and some of them could be nefarious, and some of them could be strategic, and the others could be just workforce issues.
That's fair. Last night, just last night, you invited a bunch of attorneys general up here. You all had a town hall, a lot of people. It was clear that you all work really well together. I'm curious, this case here in Oregon is somewhat unique, but also happening in other places. You guys have filed, 53 lawsuits now?
In Oregon, yeah.
53 lawsuits Oregon has participated in, and many of those lawsuits have multiple states signed on. Bring me a little bit behind the scenes. What is going on? What is the communication? What does the coalition look like that seems to be building amongst Democratic attorneys general in various states?
Well, the communication happens at multiple levels, and it happens for different reasons, right? Some of it just starts with sharing information. I'm seeing this in my community. Is anyone else seeing this, right? So we're assessing the scope of an issue, right? Some lawsuits may only involve a handful of states because they're the only states experiencing that harm. National Guard, right? That might only be one state, or ours was a little bit rare. We had California and Oregon kind of combining for a portion of that case. So that level of communication starts. Then you will have this, once we're moving down a road, right, where we are working towards, we see a common issue. So I always think of the Victim of Crime Act lawsuit that we had. That was something that all of us were experiencing. Then we decide and kind of who has the resource and who's best situated to then start working on the case. And oftentimes it's a little bit of a partnership, right? We might have, say, in Oregon, we're filing it in Oregon, so we're on the case. We partner with, say, Washington or New York or California to then execute that. And the other states will then provide different sets of facts supporting it as well, because it does take work for them to be a part of this. And then we'll get that lawsuit filed. And so that's a type of coordination. Now, there's staff level conversations happen, and then there is direct AG conversations that occur. And I think that's what you saw last night. I do not want to underestimate the power of the staff level conversations, because that is critical for any of these offices to operate and move forward. However, a lot of the Democratic attorneys general, we get along with each other, and we often have a lot of different set of values. There's different set of circumstances in each state. There's respect amongst all of us, and so we, for the most part, are able to find common ground in moving forward on things that are important in our communities. And that's what you saw last night. And of course, I love to tease them, so that's like my role.
I did notice some of that.
Because I think we can do incredibly meaningful work on behalf of people, but I think we can also do it where in a positive work environment.
One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, and I feel like it does go with how you're working with other attorneys general. It's been made, President Trump has made it very clear that just because he lost this case and he has now withdrawn his efforts to deploy National Guard troops to cities across the country, he's not done. He's not taking it off the table. And I think it's fair to say that the specter of the Insurrection Act is kind of hanging over this question of military versus military deployment into civilian cities. Is that something that you all are talking about? How much is the potential use of the Insurrection Act on the minds of yourself and your team and of the other attorneys general that you speak with?
Well, this has been a common thought by the president for more than a year, right? He was talking about this during the entire year he was running for president, all of 2024. So this is something that's incredibly well researched by a lot of our offices, and this is something that, should that come to fruition, again, we'll take that same sterile analysis, right? We'll look at the facts on the ground, apply it to the Insurrection Act, and see whether there is a case to prevent kind of what we're kind of talking about is this normalization of the military in our communities. And again, I would submit that what's going on or what did go on or is going on in Oregon does not meet the threshold for the Insurrection Act, right? Now, could circumstances manifest themselves in the United States somewhere right now that we're unaware of that might meet that? Of course, anything's possible, right? But we got to see what happens when he does it. And again, there's something that a couple of our attorneys have talked about, and I've said it a few times, is when President Trump says something, right, or sometimes when he even does an executive order, we have to look at those things and then assess whether this is thunder or whether this is lightning, right? And you'll see a lot of those executive orders are nothing, they're worth nothing more than the paper they're written on. They actually don't do anything. But you know what they do? It's wonderful political messaging, right? It'll get him that good repost on Twitter or X. I apologize, Elon. I continue to call it Twitter.
It's hard. It was a very ingrained part of the internet culture. It's hard to move away from that. I do wonder, and I think on that note, in terms of thunder versus lightning, we've also seen though that when Trump is talking about something and continues talking about it, you should listen. He's been obsessing about Greenland, and that's a whole different thing on its own. But we're 1 year now into a 4-year administration. There's been 53 lawsuits that Oregon has participated in. How do you all not burn out? How do you all stay ready and stay, at the top of your game and able to kind of do the job that you see as necessary for the next 3 years?
I think that there is a passion for the work that you do because it's meaningful, right? And it's not just the federal work. I go to the Department of Justice and we'll work on administrative issues that I believe make the Department of Justice stronger for the future. I love working on those things.
Yeah.
I would have a podcast with you about those only, but your listeners would log off in a second.
Yeah.
But it's the same thing with the federal work that we're doing. I believe in the underlying principles of what we're doing for the long-term health of our country. And that is an easy thing to wake up for, to work on. Even the Greenland issue, right? Like that's going on, and he's threatening these tariffs, right? Again, how does that tie back in? That ties back into businesses. Like I did tours of 4 different businesses in downtown Portland yesterday, all had unique stories about how the tariffs were impacting them, the prices that they have to pass on to consumers. And what people don't really realize that is U.S. citizens that are importing, that are writing a check to the U.S. government. This is not a foreign government that's paying it. It's an absolute fallacy. And so these types of circumstances are going on. And so it's a privilege to be in this role. And to me, I don't think you have the luxury of tiring out. The thing that does worry me, where I can sit there and drink another cup of coffee or whatever you need, or, I appreciate the water today.
Sure.
But it's how do we make sure that the staff and the attorneys, right, are continuing to have that same level of stamina throughout this period of time. Now, my hope is, right, because I try to be an optimist, that eventually Trump will start listening to his own lawyers, right? Because just as lawyers, advise within the state, I know his lawyers are advising him. We absolutely know that. And I bet you some of those lawyers, and probably most of them, because he's losing most of these lawsuits, I bet some are saying, hey, this probably isn't your best legal strategy. Could we try something different? Like, hey, you know what? Pass it through Congress.
Right.
Do you know how much of what he is doing right now he could do lawfully if he could just get the votes in Congress? And you know what? That's the way the system was designed. And we would all have to sit there, and maybe a lot of us wouldn't be happy with some of those results. I know I wouldn't. But that's the way the system was designed to work. If he can get the votes in a public forum, you don't get to do these things by fiat, by executive order. And then we can have that conversation publicly during the elections and say, this isn't the direction I want our country to go. But our role here is to make sure that the executive has his powers right now, his or her powers, and stays in that lane. Congress has their powers, and they stay in that lane, and we operate from there.
Talking about the Oregon DOJ and kind of the restructuring, do I understand when you came into office initially, you kind of did some restructuring of your own office? Is that right? That you kind of you created some positions underneath you. Is that right? I mean,
you want to talk about administration stuff?
I'm just a little bit curious. We don't have to get too deep into it, but I am curious. Was there the position of chief of staff before you took the office? And what are some of the positions that you created? And briefly, why do you think that it was necessary to kind of create those positions?
Right, and this is work styles. Everybody has, the different way that they see the world, and different ways for management. I'm a big believer that you got to have really smart, amazing people around you to multiply the work that you do, right? And I can't be in every little decision that's being made at the Department of Justice. But if we have trust among our leadership team and we have the right people in the right places, the department will be stronger for that. Sure. And giving people that authority. And so when we came in, what was very important to me is we wanted to create a chief of staff position, which would then complement what we call the Deputy Attorney General position, which is really in charge of a lot of our legal work within the entire division. And then the other unique position that we created was a chief operating officer. It's an interesting thing. And this came up, my mother's an accountant. She had a lot of different clients, and she would always tell me, it's like, I got this wonderful set of doctors, and they're amazing. They're the best doctors in the world. They are not good at managing a business, right? You see the same thing in law firms. Some people have that skill set, right? But there is a unique administrative skill set that can be complementary to even good lawyers with administrative skill sets. So we really wanted to bring in someone to really focus on that and strengthen the agency, because I really believe the stronger the foundation of an agency is, the healthier the culture of an agency is, right? The more stamina you have, the better work product that you engage in, and people need to enjoy and find meaning in going to work. And so that was very important to me as we move through this. That was much longer than you wanted to talk about.
No, it's fine. It's interesting. I think that idea
talk about spreadsheets and next.
Well, but looking at an agency as a business and bringing some business theory into running an agency. I mean, your background, I think what was the largest staff that you were managing before you took this job, before you got elected?
Yeah, so we had, I was part of a small law firm,
Right.
Which was, I would kind of consider it more of a boutique law firm, right? I think at its peak, we had, I think maybe 6 people who were working there at its peak. So again, not a very...
How many are at the DOJ now?
Yeah, DOJ is more than 1,600 employees, right?
So, and it makes sense, though, I think to me, that's interesting because it is a business. It is a large business.
Now, at the legislature, right, when I was the co-chair of Ways and Means, right, you are looking and you are drafting Oregon's budget in partnership with your Senate counterparts, right? When I was Speaker of the House, right, a very different set of skills that and that you bring into that conversation, right? Not only are you working with 60 independent elected representatives, which is a unique experience in and of itself, right? Really amazing people. Then you are also co-managing, very interesting, co-managing a branch of government with the Senate president, right, and a very large budget under those circumstances. So there are analogous things that go back and forth between those. But again, right, I mean, all of these things, and I really believe, is you have to have good people around you if you want to be successful. So.
All right, so wrapping it up here, you yourself, I mean, you've got a big job. What are you doing outside of work? What are you doing to keep yourself sane? Give us a little peek into the life of the Rayfield house.
Oh my gosh, that's a really good question. Excuse me. I learned to make sourdough bread. That's a real thing.
Really? During the pandemic?
No. After that's an unusual thing, right? I waited till after the pandemic to learn how to cook bread.
Late to the parade, yeah.
And my wife and I did that. Turns out I started out doing better than she did. Like, honestly, my loaves were puffing up better than her. And we both had our unique starters.
Okay.
And you know what? Like now, like it's hands down. Like I don't even bother compete. Like she studied the science. She's like weighing out what needs to go to a starter.
Or something? You've been busy?
I mean, to be honest, like she's weighing it out, and I'm just like dumping flour in and pouring it in the water. I'm thinking like
Different styles.
I'm doing it by feel,
yeah,
right?
Yeah,
like
yeah.
She's doing it, measuring it, and clearly that's working much better for her than myself. So I guess part of the hobby now is I'm not making it; I'm eating her bread. The other thing is I have a 14-year-old. So if you come down to Corvallis, right, like, I was at his band concert, right? I really try and take time to do that. I take time to make sure that he can be grumpy with me when I say, hey, we need to stop with the screens. That's a hobby of mine, is absorbing his frustration with screen time. And then I love, this is odd. I love chess. That's a weird thing. I like music quite a bit.
Now, with chess, do you like chess in person, or do you also do online chess?
So right now it's predominantly like it'll be an online chess. It's not a lot. I will play 1-minute games, speed chess, which because I started out when I was doing like a 10-minute game on a weekend, and then like family would come in and they would want to talk to me, and I was like, I can't talk now. And I realized I only can really afford a 1-minute game.
That's fair. Some end game exercises.
I got a 2-minute of time I can neglect the family before I can get back to the question. There's that, but I really love music. I love exploring different types of music, and then periodically I play tuba.
Nice.
Yeah, that's and you have to keep your yard. Like you have to have a yard. It has to be maintained.
Did you ever play in marching band or anything?
I did. I currently play in a polka band.
Really?
Called the Polkaticians.
Are there other politicians involved in this band?
Well, no.
Are you the lone political actor in the
pretty much? It was a friend of mine who he said, "Hey, I have a baritone." I was like, "Oh my gosh, you're low brass." There's a low brass thing that goes on, and I said, "Well, I play the tuba." And then all of a sudden, we were just joking around. We came up with a wonderful name. We thought we were very clever.
Yep.
And the next thing you know, we were playing in the Starlight Parade, and yeah.
That's amazing. Great. Well, let's wrapping it up here.
What do you do for your hobbies?
What do I do?
Yeah.
What do I do?
It's always about
cook.
me.
So this is why. So I don't bake. My wife bakes. I can't do the measure things out. I am all about the what does it feel like. I'm a vibes cooker.
Yeah.
I'm just all about the vibes. So I cook What else do I do? I do stained glass, actually.
Oh, really?
Thank you for the reminder. Yeah. So
Like, are you doing it like professionally, or you're going to Michael's and getting those things that we did as kids?
No,
with the
I have a
beads?
studio. I go to a studio.
Oh, wow.
I do. Yeah, I do like installation pieces. A lot of like Dreamcatcher stuff. I'm working on like a 10 by 10 panel right now.
How did this not come to the front of the conversation?
I didn't. I gotta.
It
hang
seems
some
like
of
it-
I gotta hang that. That'll be our decoration for the studio. Well, look. So I want to wrap it up here. I do want to know. We got 3 years left of both your term and the Trump administration. You know, I think it's hard to set the Trump administration aside, but I also know that you've got your own priorities that you ran on. Trump was still running. He hadn't been elected yet. What are you hoping to get done in the next 3 years?
Well, I mean, what we've been doing during the first year, right? So for me, just because that we have spent a lot of time just today talking about the Trump stuff does not give me the flexibility to ignore the other things that we really want to accomplish. And what we talked about during the election, right, is like, how do you improve community safety, right? And we started a pilot program in Washington County with DA Barton to really use our resources at the Department of Justice proactively to tackle organized crime. You think about that as sex trafficking, you can think about that as retail theft, all of these different elements, right? And partnering with local law enforcement to do that. So we're in the midst of that pilot, working in those different angles. We really wanted to improve our work as a state to protect working families, seniors, and consumers and expand on that work. So we doubled the size of the attorneys and staff doing that work here at the Oregon Department of Justice. And so for me, the next 3 years are doing that, but a heck of a lot more, right? I think we accomplished a lot in the first year. Again, strengthening the foundation of the agency as well, right? So we've done all of these things, excited about those things, but you need to do them in my kind of fashion. It's like we need to double down and continue to do that work in this next year and do even more of it, right? And that's the exciting stuff. Like all of those things that I mentioned, there's not a moment or conversation you get into those topics where you're not, hey, we're moving the ball forward and we're having fun doing it and it's meaningful work. Sometimes I think people on the front lines in the community may not necessarily draw the connections, the line in the sand between, hey, the work on lowering insulin prices and the work that we did at the Oregon Department of Justice, right? But where we sit and we're having these conversations, these cases, it's incredibly valuable, right? And those things wouldn't be going on if we didn't have like amazing people at the department, participating and being just incredible public servants. Well,
Attorney General Rayfield, thank you very much for coming and chatting with us. Really appreciate it. We'll be looking out for whatever comes next for you.
Absolutely. We'll do the podcast next from your glass shop.
That's perfect. Yeah, we'll do it. That's perfect. We'll do it in the studio. I'll show you how to cut some glass.
Well, that would be fun.
It's not that hard. It's not that hard. It's totally doable. All right. Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.